Okay. Last week we started our study on Esau, and we started in Genesis 25, the end of Genesis 25. We read through the birth of Esau and Jacob. It's kind of funny that was weird. Kind of funny, we always say Jacob and Esau when Esau was first, but it's just kind of our vernacular to say Jacob and Esau because Jacob is the one on whom most attention is given, and obviously the one through which the promises came. We see how that Rebekah was barren, and so there's obviously God's power involved. Miraculous it would be the suspension, or the observable suspension of natural law. Obviously, you can observe, I guess you could technically, a barren woman becoming pregnant, but you can't observe the actual suspension of natural law or whatever it was, the power of God that made it available for her to be pregnant. But it was still God's power involved. We talked about them being twins, how that God had foreseen and knew exactly how things were going to happen. It was part of the plan of God that Jacob would be the one who would receive the firstborn blessing and so forth. We talked about the fact that Esau, a lot of times we talk about Esau meaning red. Esau means rough. Edom means red. Esau and Edom, remember Edom after Esau sold his birthright for some red stew, that's when he was referred to as Edom, and that's where the term red comes from. We also talked about the fact that Esau was the father of the Edomites. Remember, God said here in Genesis 25 that there were two nations in the womb of Rebekah. Obviously, Jacob represented one, and the Edomites with Esau as well. So I do want to go to Joshua 24 for a second, starting in verse 3. Joshua 24, starting in verse 3. This is God as he is, so Joshua speaking on, thus says the Lord God. He says in verse 3, I took your father Abraham from the other side of the river, led him throughout all the land of Canaan, and multiplied his descendants, and gave him Isaac. To Isaac I gave Jacob and Esau. To Esau I gave the mountains of Seir to possess, but Jacob and his children went down to Egypt. And then it continues along, obviously going back to the account of the Exodus and so forth, and God's deliverance of his people. But this refers to the fact that at some point after Genesis 28 verse 9, Esau had moved to the mountains of Seir. And then he came back for which there was that period of reconciliation between Esau and Jacob. And then he resettled back in the mountains of Seir in Genesis 36 verse 6, and he stayed there, apparently, because that's where all of his children came from, or were born ultimately there, and that's where the Edomites began. In Deuteronomy 23 and in verse 7, I passed over some of these last class. I wanted to kind of go back and take a look at some of these because it's kind of interesting. We talked about the fact that Esau, he's not really mentioned a whole lot after the events of Genesis 25 through 36 or so. After that, there's only a handful of references to him. There are other references to the Edomites, which are the children of Esau. But here in Deuteronomy chapter 23 and in verse 7, you shall not abhor an Edomite, for he is your brother. You shall not abhor an Egyptian, because you are an alien in his land. The children of the third generation born to them may enter the assembly of the Lord. And this is we actually looked at part of this passage with a couple studies ago with Balak and Balaam. And notice how verse 4 and 5, this is actually the Ammonite and Moabite. They're not allowed to enter the assembly of the Lord of Israel because they didn't meet them on the road with bread and water. They hired Balaam and so forth. So within that list of who is allowed in the assembly of Israel, they are not to abhor an Edomite or an Egyptian. I think that's kind of interesting. And then, let's see, Deuteronomy chapter 2. Well, we'll go to Numbers 20 first. Numbers chapter 20 and in verse 14. So this is, remember we talked with Balaam and Balak, we talked about the journey Israel went to get into Canaan, how that they went on the east side of the Jordan, up along the King's Highway, up through the Moabites and the Ammonites, and so forth. But part of the reason why they had to take that route was, well, obviously it was the plan of God, but part of the issue was that Edom would not let them through their land. Edom was kind of between them and that west side of the Jordan. And in verse 14, now Moses sent messengers from Kadesh, the king of Edom, or from Kadesh to the king of Edom. Thus says your brother Israel, you know all the hardship that has befallen us, how our fathers went down to Egypt, and we dwelt in Egypt a long time, and the Egyptians afflicted us and our fathers. When we cried out to the Lord, he heard our voice, and sent the angel, and brought us up out of Egypt. Now here we are in Kadesh, a city on the edge of your border. Please let us pass through your country. We will not pass through fields or vineyards, nor will we drink water from wells. We will go along the king's highway. We will not turn aside to the right hand or to the left until we've passed through your territory. Then Edom said to him, so this is the response from the Edomites, the king of Edom, you shall not pass through my land, lest I come out against you with the sword. And verse 19, so the children of Israel said to him, we will go by the highway, and if I or my livestock drink any of your water, then I will pay for it. Let me only pass through on foot, nothing more. Then he said, you shall not pass through. So Edom came out against them with many men and with a strong hand. Thus Edom refused to give Israel passage through his territory, so Israel turned away from him. I think it's interesting how, starting with the response from the people of Edom, you're going back to a singular pronouns. It's as if it's a conversation between Jacob, or Israel, and Esau, or Edom. I just kind of think that's a really interesting situation here that Moses, again, inspired by God, is writing it this way, showing that relationship that should still exist, or at least, by blood anyway, and yet, obviously, they aren't. So they had to go all the way around Edom along the west side to get back to the King's Highway. They weren't able to go east and then up into the King's Highway. So I just think that's really interesting. In Deuteronomy chapter 2, we actually see this play out. Deuteronomy 2, starting in verse 1. And so this is kind of the recounting of this journey. Then we turned and journeyed into the wilderness of the way of the Red Sea, as the Lord spoke to me, and we skirted Mount Seir for many days. Now, just to kind of be clear, there is a singular, the highest mount of Seir is called Mount Seir. But there's also a mountain range that's also called the Mountains of Seir. And so the range extends north to south. And so what he's describing here is this whole range. It's not just the single mountain, it's the whole range that they're skirting around, because that was part of the border of Edom, and that they weren't allowed in, remember. The Lord spoke to me saying, verse 3, you have skirted this mountain long enough, turn northward, and command the people, saying, you are about to pass through the territory of your brethren, the descendants of Esau who live in Seir, and they will be afraid of you. Therefore watch yourselves carefully. Do not meddle with them, for I will not give you any of their land. No, not so much as one footstep, because I have given Mount Seir to Esau as a possession. You shall buy food from them with money, that you may eat, and you shall also buy water from them with money, that you may drink. And then in verse 7, for the Lord your God has blessed you in all the work of your hand. He knows you're trudging through this great wilderness. These 40 years the Lord your God has been with you. You have lacked nothing. And when we pass beyond our brethren, the descendants of Esau who dwell in Seir, away from the road of the plain, away from Eleth and Ezion Geber, we turned and passed by way of the wilderness of Moab. And then, of course, God, in verse 9, again, this is part of what we discussed with Balaam and Balak. He says, you're not to go up against Moab. You're not to fight them because of their relationship with Lot. And so there was a whole lot of background in terms of blood relation that was going on through all of this. But I really find that Numbers account really interesting, the way that it's like a conversation between Jacob and Esau, but it's their descendants. It's representative of the nations themselves. Again, going back to what God said regarding the two nations that were going to come from Rebekah and Jacob. All right, anything through that?
Well, the Edomites, what they chose to do as a nation, is that a reflection on Esau somehow? I mean, that's not child,
Yeah, well, and to that end, actually, I'm glad you brought that up because skip over real quick to Genesis 26 because I think this is telling kind of some of what we end up seeing with the Edomites because they're referenced, like I said, the Edomites are referenced on several occasions throughout the Old Testament. In fact, there's entire chapters devoted to God's judgment on Edom. And in Genesis chapter 26 and in notice verse 30, so this is after, and we'll go back to chapter 35 or 25 here in just a minute. But this is after Esau sold his birthright, yes, after his birthright. So here in verse, huh? Say what? He stole the birthright. Yeah, he stole the birthright. There's the firstborn blessing and the birthright. Yeah. So here in verse 34, when Esau was 40 years old, he took his wives Judith, the daughter of Beri the Hittite, and Basemath, the daughter of Elon the Hittite, and they were a grief of mind to Isaac and Rebekah. We talked a little bit about this last week, but what's interesting is we end up seeing references later on to the gods of Esau's wives. And in fact, this is part of the reason why this was a grief to the mind of Isaac and Rebekah, because he didn't marry like from his mother's family or from anyone who believed in Jehovah. Instead, he went after these women, not unlike Samson, I guess, a little bit. Remember, Samson married a woman of the Philistines, and kind of course, Samson was a whole issue in and of itself, but there was a whole lot of examples throughout the Old Testament where individuals who were faithful to God, or at least should have been, marrying non-faithful people, non-Jehovah believers or worshipers, and that took their hearts away from Jehovah. What's a great example? Solomon. Yeah, he's probably the most well-known of that happening. But it makes me wonder about Esau, because later we find that the Edomites were completely given over to idolatry, completely. And it just kind of makes me wonder if the seeds of that started here. Had Esau married individuals who were believers in Jehovah and followers of Jehovah, would that have changed anything? Maybe, maybe not. You know, of course, we see from Noah, okay, remember there were 8 souls saved through the flood, and they started again. And yet, from his 3 sons, who presumably were faithful, we know Noah was, and certainly those 8 souls, we associate the idea of the righteous ones that God identified. But from Ham, Shem, and Japheth came all the other nations, and eventually through the ages, some of them may have stayed faithful to Jehovah for a period of time, but eventually they all went astray, as Paul points out in Romans chapter 1. So it's not necessarily that Esau wasn't a faithful servant of God. And to be fair, there's some stuff in here, as we kind of noted last week, there's some stuff in here that's not really fair to Esau. You know, there's some situations that take place that you kind of feel for Esau. A lot of times Esau is painted as this evil person, and there are some parts of Esau that certainly maybe could have been done better, and maybe better decisions or whatnot, but that's true of all of us. It's never once said that he was a righteous person, to be fair, but it's also never made clear that he was necessarily evil either. And so it just makes me wonder, especially with marrying these 2 women of the Hittites when he was 40 years old, if that had an impact on Esau and ultimately had an impact on his descendants as well. But whether or not it did, we don't know. Thoughts or comments through that? Yes, sir.
Well, that necessarily reflects this question about Edom's character mirroring Esau. But the kind of read over to Obadiah, they're condemned, the Edomites, the whole book is about that.
Yeah.
They're condemned for standing by when their brethren,
Israel.
what's left of that nation, is oppressed. But not just that, on multiple occasions they also went in and plundered or were part of the attack.
Yeah.
So their character doesn't seem to be too great, and it does somewhat seem to mirror
Yeah, Esau.
his vengeance, his violence against his brother based on what had happened to him.
Yeah. Yeah, and that parallel, certainly, part of that parallel is being borne out by God referencing in Numbers, and then the fact that God wouldn't allow Israel to plunder any of Edom's stuff, but later on, Edom was certainly willing to plunder Israel's stuff or Judah's stuff. There does seem to be a little bit of parallel there between Esau and the nation that ultimately came from him. Yeah. Any other thoughts through that? All right, in Genesis chapter 28, so we'll skip 27 for a second. In Genesis chapter 28, verses 1 through, verse 5 or so, we see how the end of chapter 27 makes it seem as though Rebekah has come up with this plan to get Isaac out of the house and out of the land back to her father's place, to get him away from Esau because of the danger associated with Esau, which we'll look at in just a minute. Although it probably served a dual purpose, really. Yes, it got Jacob away from Esau, but it also enabled Jacob to marry someone of the people of Rebekah, of Laban. And as a result, that certainly... In fact, you see here in verse 3, may God Almighty bless you, make you fruitful and multiply you, that you may be an assembly of peoples, to give you the blessing of Abraham, to you and your descendants with you, that you may inherit the land in which you are a stranger with God, which God gave to Abraham. So Isaac sends Jacob away. He goes to Laban, and of course that's going to end up bringing about the situation with Leah and Rachel. But here in verse 6, notice Esau saw that Isaac had blessed Jacob and sent him away to Padan Aram to take himself a wife from there, and that as he blessed him, he gave him a charge, saying, you shall not take a wife from the daughters of Canaan. What had Esau done? He'd taken 2 wives from the daughters of Canaan, the Hittites, and that Jacob had obeyed his father and his mother and had gone to Padan Aram. So Esau saw that the daughters of Canaan did not please his father Isaac. So Esau went to Ishmael and took Mahalath, the daughter of Ishmael, Abraham's son, the sister of Nebajoth, to be his wife, in addition to the wives he had. So he goes to Ishmael, and of course, what's the association with Ishmael? What's the relation there with Ishmael? Huh? I heard everybody. Okay. Technically the firstborn of Abraham, but not the firstborn of Abraham and Sarah, and certainly not the child of promise. In fact, that whole thing gets brought up again in Galatians chapter 4. But it's interesting because what does this sound like to you? What is Esau doing? Huh? Well, I mean, he's going to get a wife from his family rather than the people of Canaan because his parents didn't like that. So what do you think Esau's effort is? What is the reason for doing this? Huh? Yeah, I think it was an attempt to appease his parents, to get approval from his parents. And I just think that it's kind of sad in a way because Esau sees how that Jacob was blessed and in his going to Laban, and he's trying to gain that approval from his parents as well. And I just kind of, it's kind of sad a little bit because this is his effort to try to appease them. I don't know if it works or not. Obviously, he'd married the 2 Hittite women first to start with, but he ends up marrying a daughter of Ishmael, and whether or not that was necessarily any better, I don't know if the children of Ishmael were actually believers or followers of Jehovah at this point, but even still, I just think this is about Esau's attempt to gain his parents' approval, and it's just kind of sad. Thoughts or comments through that? Going back to chapter 25 real quick. Okay, so we noticed the beginnings here, how that Rebekah and Jacob, it was Rebekah's plan. Okay, Jacob goes along with it to trick Isaac into giving Jacob the firstborn blessing. He'd already gotten the inheritance, the birthright, okay, but he hadn't gotten the firstborn blessing. And that was kind of if you wanted to say one was more important than the other, the birthright wasn't quite as important as the firstborn blessing. The birthright involved monetary stuff. a double portion in terms of inheritance. But the birthright, the firstborn blessing, that referred to who was taking over, to whom was the torch being passed, who was going to be the leader of the family of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob now. Who's going to be the one that's going to be in charge? That's kind of the component here. And of course, while we're not told that this is Rebekah's thought process, it does come to mind, why would Rebekah do this? Obviously, and remember we talked before also about the danger of playing favorites with our kids, and how that this is a recurring theme in especially in the Old Testament, where you have Jacob and Joseph, Jacob and Joseph, how Jacob loved Joseph more than any of the others, and that caused a whole issue, which is ironic given the fact that there was certainly some sibling rivalry between Jacob and Esau, because who loved Esau the most? Isaac. And who loved Jacob the most? Rebekah. Okay, and so this kind of sibling rivalry is kind of a continual type thing, kind of begetting itself over and over and over again. But again, Rebekah was told by God that two nations were in a room. One, the older will serve the younger. Now, whether or not this is Rebekah's attempt to try to make that prophecy come about, to help God, okay, it doesn't say that, but it just kind of, I don't know why she would do this, other than the fact, again, maybe it was just the fact that she loved Jacob and she felt he was more deserving than Esau of the firstborn blessing. I don't know. But it is interesting that she's the one coming up with this plan. So we see Isaac blessing Jacob here in verse 28. Therefore may God give you of the dew of heaven, of the fatness of the earth, plenty of grain and wine. Let people serve you and nations bow down to you. Be master over your brethren. Let your mother's sons bow down to you. Cursed be everyone who curses you, and blessed be those who bless you. Now, this firstborn blessing that is being given represents kind of an interesting, you could almost call it a transaction, I guess you could say. It's a binding situation, because notice what happens here in verse 30. Now it happened as soon as Isaac had finished blessing Jacob, and Jacob had scarcely gone out from the presence of Isaac his father, that Esau his brother came in from his hunting. He also had made savory food, brought it to his father, and said to his father, Let my father arise and eat of his son's game, that your soul may bless me. And his father Isaac said to him, Who are you? So he said, I am your son, your firstborn Esau. Then Isaac trembled exceedingly and said, Who? Or who? Where is the one who hunted game and brought it to me? I ate all of it before you came, and I have blessed him, and indeed he shall be blessed. I think it's really interesting that Isaac trembled exceedingly. Now, I don't think this is anger. I think it's more so fear and confusion as to what has happened. Although, remember, Isaac seemed to have some suspicions during that whole interchange between him and Jacob. He says it's Jacob's voice, but the smell, the skin, it all feels like and seems like Esau. And in verse 34, when Esau heard the words of his father, he cried with an exceedingly great and bitter cry, and said to his father, Bless me, me also, O my father. But he said, Your brother came with deceit and has taken away your blessing. And Esau said, Is he not rightly named Jacob? The name Jacob actually means supplanter or usurper. For he has supplanted me these 2 times. He took away my birthright, and now look, he has taken away my blessing. And he said, Have you not reserved a blessing for me? So notice, first of all, we see that these are 2 separate things, birthright and the firstborn blessing. But also notice in verse 37, Isaac answered and said to Esau, Indeed, I have made him your master, and all his brethren I have given to him as servants. With grain and wine I have sustained him. What shall I do now for you, my son? And Esau said to his father, Have you only one blessing, my father? Bless me, me also, O my father. And Esau lifted up his voice and wept. Then Isaac his father answered and said to him, Behold, your dwelling shall be of the fatness of the earth, and of the dew of heaven from above. By your sword you shall live, and you shall serve your brother. And it shall come to pass, when you become restless, that you shall break his yoke from your neck. So, and we'll get to verse 41 here in just a second. But notice the language that Isaac uses here. He says, your brother has come with the seed. He has taken away your blessing. And then verse 37, indeed, I have made him your master. All his brethren I have given to him as servants. In fact, in verse 33, he says, indeed, he shall be blessed. It seems as though the firstborn blessing under the patriarchal law, or whatever law you want to call it, the term phrase patriarchal law isn't found in the Old Testament, but whatever law that was before the Mosaical law, the one under which Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and everyone lived, it would seem as though this was a binding component of whatever it was God had given. Because wouldn't it just have been just as easy for Isaac to say, oh, I made a mistake. Well, you know what, just kind of 86, scratch the blessing to Isaac or to Jacob. Now I'll give you the firstborn blessing. And you know what? He was kind of rude and didn't, he kind of, I don't know, manipulated you into selling him your birthright. So I'll give you the double portion, because that wasn't very brotherly of him. He doesn't say that. At no point does Isaac even suggest that this can be changed. In fact, everything says, indeed, he shall be blessed. There is nothing I can do. It's done. And it seems as though under whatever law, we call it the patriarchal law, whatever law that they had, that God had given them, both the birthright and the firstborn blessing, they were a permanent type of thing. Once it was done, it was done. And again, whether there was some, and I think it's interesting, he shall be blessed, it just goes to show that this is the reason why Esau was so upset, because it was done. And it wasn't just his birthright. It's not like he sold his firstborn blessing and now he's mad about it because he sold it, but that was really his fault. No, this isn't even about his birthright. This is about the firstborn blessing. He didn't sell that. I don't even know if he could sell that. But yet Jacob took it by deceit. And it's just again, you see kind of the situation that Esau's in. You feel bad for him. You feel sorry for him, because he hasn't done, there's nothing been recorded that he's done anything evil or even necessarily sinful. I don't know if it was unlawful to marry of the daughters of the Hittites. It doesn't sound as though it was. It says that Rebekah and Isaac were grieved. It sounded more like it was something that from generation to generation it was passed on. You marry from the family who follow Jehovah. You don't go after the people of false gods. Yet Esau did. Okay, that was a mistake. He shouldn't have done that, I don't think, but he hasn't really done anything to deserve what's happened to him. And I just think it's really interesting, because there's a whole backstory here that we're going to get to in a little bit that kind of helps us to put it in perspective, what all's happening and what Esau's reaction should have been. But he's human. We're all human. And our reactions, probably there's millions of things we can look back in our life and say, I should have reacted better to that. I should have handled that a little bit better. Esau probably could have handled this a little bit better too. But from a human perspective, I feel like from a human perspective, he's justified in being angry. I mean, I'm sure any of us would be angry. Thoughts or comments through that?
It seems like in every family, there's one kid that's going to everything
The hard way.
Esau just seems that way, and it's hard to face the reality about yourself sometimes, because he says he took that birthright from you. He didn't.
He sold it.
Esau didn't. Whether it was immaturity, whether it was a lack of understanding, or I don't know, but he did a foolish thing before, and then all this happened later.
Yeah.
I just feel like he had to learn things the hard way. Thought, wow, I never thought I would get to this
Yeah.
point where I could lose it all.
Some families actually have 3 or 4 kids who want to learn it the hard way.
Then as well,
Don't we, hon?
around in middle kids would just watch the show.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Any other thoughts to that? Going down to verse 41 then. So Esau hated Jacob because of the blessing with which his father blessed him. And Esau said in his heart, the days of mourning for my father are at hand. Then I will kill my brother Jacob. And the words of Esau, her older son, were told to Rebekah. So she sent and called Jacob, her younger son, and said to him, surely your brother Esau comforts himself concerning you by intending to kill you. Now therefore, my son, obey my voice, arise and flee to my brother Laban in Haran, and stay with him a few days until your brother's fury turns away, until your brother's anger turns away from you, and he forgets what you have done to him. Then I will send and bring you from there. Why should I be bereaved also of you both in one day? Now, I think this is an interesting statement from Rebekah. So first of all, he intends to kill him. Whether or not Esau actually would have gone through with it when push came to shove, I don't know. Esau was a man of the field. He was kind of a more primal, I guess you could say. I mean, he was hunting and he was in the wilderness. You know, he was just kind of an outdoorsman. Certainly, Jacob probably would not have stood a chance in a fight against him. But whether or not Esau would have done it, we don't know for sure. But he certainly intended to. That was his intention. Now, what Rebekah does is she says, go and stay with Laban for a while. And in a few days, or some time, Esau's anger will pass. Okay, this will all kind of just flow over. What's the phrase? Blow over. There we go. It'll all blow over. Okay, and it'll just go away, and everything will be okay. Now, when she says he'll forget what you've done to him, I don't think she actually literally means he'll forget about it, because you don't forget something like that. But at least the anger and the perhaps violence of heart that is within Esau may be forgotten over time. Ironically and interestingly enough, it does. That actually does is what exactly happens. But then she says, why should I be bereaved also of you both in one day? Now, whether she's referring to what would happen in the event that Esau killed Jacob, that Jacob would die, and then presumably under the law, just as it was under the Mosaical law, what would happen to one who murders someone? They would be put to death. Okay? Whether this was the case under the patriarchal law, we don't know, but that could very well be what Rebekah is referring to, because if Esau kills you, he will be put to death. That could be what she's referring to. Or, alternatively, it could be that Esau found out that this was all Rebekah's scheme, and he now hates his mother as well. And so, as a result, that might be what she's referring to, is that he kills you, and he's already kind of disowned me because of my hand in helping you trick Isaac. And so, I would be bereaved of you both, because he's going to kill you. And there's a third option as well, is that, because remember, Esau says he's going to wait till his father dies, and then he's going to kill Isaac. It could be when she says you both, that she's actually talking about Isaac and Jacob, that she would be bereaved of both Isaac and Jacob, and it may not have anything to do with Esau. I tend to lean towards the first option, that as with the Mosaical law, it's very probable under the patriarchal law, if someone murdered even their brother, or especially maybe their brother, they would be put to death. So I tend to think it was probably that one that she's referring to. Thoughts or comments through that? Verse 46, Rebekah said to Isaac, I am weary of my life because of the daughters of Heth. Who were the daughters of Heth? These were the peoples of whom Esau married his first two wives, remember? Like these who are the daughters of the land, what good will my life be to me if, as she says, if Jacob takes a wife of the daughters of Heth? So just as Esau had taken wives of the daughters of Heth, what good would my life be to me if Jacob does the same thing? Now, I think that's interesting because it would seem to suggest or imply that Rebekah seems to think that some of Esau's actions, his character, may have been affected or influenced by the daughters of Heth, by his two wives that were Hittites. Okay, whether or not that's true, and again, this serves a dual purpose. It gets it gets Jacob out of the land, gets him to Laban, and gets him away from any danger from Esau. Okay, but then there's that dual purpose. She does not want Jacob marrying from the daughters of the Hittites, and the fact that she says, I'm weary of my life because of the daughters of Heth, okay, it's bad enough Esau, the one I don't like the most, he married of the daughters of Heth. What would my life be to me if my favorite son married of the daughters of Heth? And it just suggests that maybe there's this influence that these individuals were having on Esau. She doesn't want that to happen to Jacob. Thoughts or comments through that?
They all lived under the same roof, didn't they?
Oh, yeah.
They all came in together.
And that could have been causing a lot of strife, too.
Character on their son, but it could have just been they were hard to live with.
That could be.
Bad daughters-in-law.
Yeah, that could be. Yeah, I hadn't thought about that. That's true.
More coming into the house than you did.
Last thing I want is more of them in here. That could be. That's a good point. Yeah, that's true. They are, yeah.
Is this Heth, is that different than back in 26 and 34, the daughters of Beriah and Bader, and said the daughters of Elon? Are they different?
They're all of the tribe of the Hittites. I believe they're all the tribe of the Hittites. That's what the daughters of Heth were. Yeah. All right. All right, so in Deuteronomy chapter 21, real quick, before we move on in our account here. So I do want to bring up Deuteronomy 21 and verse 15 regarding the law. This is the Mosaic law, remember, okay, regarding the birthright. So there is a component of the birthright that was retained in the Mosaic law. So starting in verse 15, and I think this is kind of interesting given the fact that this happened to Jacob. If a man has two wives, one loved and the other unloved, and they have borne him children, both the loved and the unloved, and if the firstborn son is of her who is unloved, then it shall be on the day he bequeaths his possessions to his sons, that he must not bestow firstborn status on the son of the loved wife in preference to the son of the unloved, the true firstborn. But he shall acknowledge the son of the unloved wife as the firstborn by giving him a double portion of all that he has. For he is the beginning of his strength. The right of the firstborn is his. Now, I find that really interesting that God spells that out here, because that actually happened with Joseph, Jacob and Joseph. Joseph was far from the firstborn, but he was the firstborn of Rachel. And Joseph was the one who received the double portion, the birthright. He received the double portion of inheritance from his father. And God, he doesn't mention Jacob by name here, or Joseph, but the fact of the matter is, I mean, you can clearly see the reference that this is exactly what the situation was with Leah and Rachel. That one was unloved and the other was loved. And the one that was loved, her firstborn, received the birthright. And so there was a component of the birthright that went from the patriarchal law into the Mosaical law, talking about inheritance. And then in Hebrews chapter 11, Hebrews 11 and in verse 20. Now, this is one of the few references to Esau in the New Testament. But notice how verse 20, by faith Isaac blessed Jacob and Esau concerning things to come. And then he goes on, by faith Jacob, when he was dying, blessed each of the sons of Joseph and worshipped, leaning on the top of his staff. Remember what two sons were the sons of Joseph that he blessed? Ephraim and Manasseh. Yeah. But I think that's interesting that it's Jacob and Esau listed here. Almost always when we're talking about firstborn who receive the birthright and firstborn blessing, it's the firstborn first and then the next. And it goes by the genealogy. But here in verse 20, by faith Isaac blessed Jacob and Esau concerning things to come. Jacob was blessed first. He received the firstborn blessing, then Esau as well. And with those blessings, and of course it was by faith that Isaac did it, because, again, this was binding. What Isaac blessed them, Esau and Jacob, concerning, that's what was going to happen. And Isaac couldn't change it. And so I just think that's really interesting that Jacob's mentioned first. He's going to be the one in charge. Esau will serve his brother. And that's exactly what ends up happening. All right, we will stop there. We will pick up with our account back in Genesis next Wednesday night. Thank you, everybody.